the Executive Director of the Energy Systems Integration Group. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we are a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information and resources for renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through our workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, and technical resource materials. Our most recent activity was supposed to have been our spring technical workshop scheduled for March in Tucson, which we moved online during March and April due to the coronavirus. Similar arrangements are being made for our annual forecasting and markets workshop, which was going to be held in Denver next month. These sessions are open to everyone, so please feel free to register on the ESIG website. These workshops deal with the full range of issues associated with integrating wind and solar into electric, gas, and thermal systems. They also deal with the coupling to energy-consuming infrastructures, especially electric transportation, buildings, and industry. ESIG is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you will be pleasantly surprised. You can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. So please use the question and answer box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, not the chat box, to submit questions. We plan to save 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to use the Q&A box. Okay, so today our webinar is on the topic of MISO's Renewable Integration Impact Assessment. Based on registrations, it looks like this is another quite popular topic. The webinar will feature Jordan Bakke of MISO, a recognized leader in the field of renewable integration in North America. Jordan is the manager of policy studies in MISO, focusing on how public policy and changing economic conditions impact energy and gas systems for the MISO footprint. I first met Jordan about 10 years ago, shortly after he got out of college and went to MISO, and I knew then he was going places. He has held many roles at MISO, working in resource forecasting, transmission planning, and renewable integration. His current work deals with understanding the impacts of renewables on the planning and operation of the MISO system. I feel very fortunate to have Jordan here with us today. On a personal note, I did take a look on LinkedIn last night, and I found that Jordan and I have 55 mutual connections, so I guess we must share some common interests, Jordan. I greatly value the contributions of Jordan and MISO to ESIG and the industry, and I look forward to what Jordan has to say. Today, renewable energy, namely wind and solar, is the fastest growing resource in MISO. There are many questions that need to be explored and answered in order to understand and address the impacts these resources will have on reliability and performance of the grid. MISO's Renewable Integration Impact Assessment provides an in-depth, systematic analysis of how the system behaves as more renewable energy resources enter MISO's overall generation fleet. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Jordan, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. I just want to confirm that you can hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you good.
Great. Welcome. I'm glad to be here with ESIG. It's been a very valuable organization to myself and others for many years, and I'm privileged to be able to present to the audience here today. And these webinars kind of fit into the normal way the world is working now with everything online, so it's going pretty well. So I guess MISO in general, Charlie, you kind of introduced it at your beginning, has a role to play in understanding the impact of resource change in the system. And figuring out how we in the broader industry will deal with these changes, changing our processes and systems through understanding of the impacts. So getting into the presentation today, I first want to spend a little bit of time highlighting where we came from. So 15 years ago, even before my time within the industry, a lot of the early studies focused on the impact of wind coming in and constructed their analysis assuming that wind was a random resource or energy resource that could provide energy to the system.
I think we may have lost Jordan. I'm not sure. See, his video is gone and his voice is gone. Everything was working well on the connection when we checked it out before the webinar. Let's hold on just a minute or two and see if Jordan comes back. Ryan, can you see Jordan's connection? Did he drop off and is he trying to get back in again?
Yeah, it looks like his internet went down, so let me, I'll follow up with him real quick.
Okay. Unfortunately, as I'm sure all of you know, the internet connections at home are not always as robust as the ones in the office buildings. Hopefully just bear with us for a few minutes and we'll get this connection reestablished. I think Jordan's got a really good story to tell on the renewables integration impact study. Ryan, if the internet connection is down with Jordan, we can always go to a backup plan, have him dial in and just tell you when to change the slides and he can view them on his own machine without the internet connection.
Yeah. Jordan, are you back?
For those of you, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say he dropped off, so he should be trying to get back on right now.
Does he have a telephone number to call in?
Yes, he should.
For those of you that are just signing on, our presenter has had an internet connection problem and he's trying to get back on again. So just bear with us for a few more minutes. Hopefully get the connection reestablished one way or the other and get on with the webinar.
Here he comes.
Okay, I see it. Jordan's video is back on. Jordan, perhaps you're still on mute. You can.
His audio hasn't connected yet. There he is.
There's the microphone. Looks like you're back, Jordan.
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Let me just mention, Jordan, if your internet is having a problem, you can always call in using the telephone line and Ryan can advance the slides for you and you can talk from your computer version. But let's go ahead. This works.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'll start over. I'm not sure exactly when you lost me. So thinking back 15 years ago, when we first started doing wind integration studies on the footprint, us meaning the broader industry, a lot of those initial studies focused on viewing wind as a random resource that provided energy when it was available, but with kind of poor understanding of the performance. And the conclusion from some of those early studies was that the amount of wind and solar renewable energy that we could add was quite low. Because of this randomness, we couldn't rely on them. Follow-up work found that with some targeted changes to the way we think about renewable energy and wind and solar, we could increase its penetration quite a bit and successfully integrate it onto the system. A few of those initial conclusions focused around the need to understand the availability of the resource, allow operators control of those resources, to back their output down when needed, as well as spread or diversify over a wider geographic area. MISO has successfully implemented a lot of those early recommendations in the organization, and is now integrated almost 10% of its energy from wind now. We're up over 20 gigawatts on the system by focusing on operational forecasting of wind and more recently solar, allowing full integration into SCADA, into the day-ahead real-time markets of wind and solar resources, regional transmission development in order to blend the output and variability of the resources over a broader area, and expanding the footprint. And I think the question that we all are asking right now is, what are additional challenges that we all may face as the penetration or the share of renewable energy increases much more rapidly, much farther than we've seen today. When we look at our forecasts, our members' projections, other industry forecasts, we're projecting a significant share of the energy in the energy system to be met by renewable resources, and understanding what those impacts are so we can prepare for them and proactively adapt it now is critically important. So 4 years ago or so, MISO embarked on an adventure to understand what the impacts of growing levels of renewables were to the system. And much of the work was based on an early hypothesis that was coming out of renewable integration work in other countries, as well as studies in the United States, showing that as you increase the amount of renewables into the system, the complexity of that integration increases exponentially. And so we wanted to see for MISO and the broader Eastern Interconnect if some of those hypotheses held true, and then if so, what were the cause of those, doing more of a root cause analysis. We divided the work into 4 specific focus areas to try to do detailed but integrated analysis on this through resource adequacy, understanding how the availability of the resource impacted the system, energy adequacy, looking at the operation and delivery of renewable energy, and then operating reliability. What happens if something goes wrong, if we have an outage on the generation or transmission system? Can we maintain reliability both in the steady state and the dynamics domain? And the conclusion that we've come to with all of this work is that around 30% annual average renewable energy, we see an inflection point, a point where the complexity of the system sharply increases from where we've been in the past. And this is due to some specific areas that I'll spend the bulk of the discussion on today going over. The first one is resource unavailability. Renewable resources are driven by the weather. Solar is available when the sun's out, wind's available when wind power production is available when wind is blowing. And so that variable availability presents an issue as penetration increases. Another one is traditional reliability and congestion issues as we have resources being built in remote areas, as they're being built in areas that are different than we see them today. There's a need or a stress on the current design of the system in a way that it wasn't designed for, and will need a significant reconfiguration. And then thirdly is flexibility or inflexibility of the system in order to deal with the increasing variability. And then last is on-grid instability. As you have more electronic or inverter-based resources on the system, the interaction and the decrease in synchronous machines causes new stability concerns than what we've traditionally been used to looking at, and a need to design and innovate around that need. So if you bring this together, one of the things that I always enjoy at every ESIG technical workshop is when Charlie gets up and talks about the incredible decline in renewable energy costs. And for the purpose of this discussion today, I've plotted the NREL ATB costs as part of the bottom curve. And what we see going in the future is as we put more renewables in and as time goes on, the costs of the facilities themselves are continually decreasing, and they've been decreasing at a rapid rate. When we factor this in against the integration complexity that we're starting to see increase, at some point in the future, we're likely to turn the curve on this under our current technology assumptions, under the tools that we have available to us today. And we're likely to start to see an increase in the total cost of integrating these type of resources into the system. So I think the question that we all need to ask is there a way to bend this cost curve down, either through better coordination and planning, or through new technology innovation? And so that's really the ask or the call is, as we understand these areas of concern and complexity on the system, what are the best ways to deal with them, either through proactive use of existing technology or coupled with new innovation. So the rest of the discussion, I'm going to go into the causes of this complexity. First, diving into the resource adequacy domain. So how is the availability of wind and solar resources changing the way we view resource adequacy and the ability to serve load on the system? So the first and most acute risk that we find is that the shift, or that we're shifting when we're concerned about serving load. So as we have more renewables, especially solar, coming down the system, it's very coincident around the middle of the day, and as the sun sets in the evening, we have the traditional California duck curve issue that's been talked about at many times. In MISO, it's a little bit different because we have a share of solar coming online, but we also have a high share of wind coming onto the system, and that helps mitigate some of the issues that we're likely to see within the early portion of the day. But it concentrates a lot of that risk in the evening hours as the sun is setting before the wind has picked up, and it pushes the risk away from the traditional load peak into the still higher loading conditions, but the low renewable availability conditions. And so it leads to a need to focus on both generation availability more directly, along with the load forecast and when we're likely to see high loading conditions. So the chart that you see here shows the net load, so the load minus renewable availability. And you see that over the flat portion in the middle, that starts to shift that net load peak more into the evening. And we've done a lot of resource adequacy analysis, so loss of load, looking specifically at loss of load probability on this side. and you see those area curves towards the bottom shift towards the right and become more narrow, so concentrated into the evening hours. I'm going to explore this concept a little bit through the next couple of slides here. So the consequence of this shifting net load curve or shifting generation availability as compared to the load need is that the capacity value of renewables decreases as a function of its penetration. We've seen this with wind in MISO historically over the last decade, and when we project this out, the trend continues, but it's pretty slow. As we saturate more and more resources into the system, the fall in capacity value is relatively mild, and it isn't highly correlated or coupled with the specific deployment of the resource. Solar, on the other hand, is a little bit different. We see a rapid fall as we shift the net load peak into the evening hours. But we also find that it's highly dependent on the deployment within the system. The more westerly or the more coincident that we have solar deployment being with the load needs of the system, the slower the decline and the higher the initial starting value is. And that's what we're seeing between the two lines on this chart. When you blend the two technologies together on the right, it helps stabilize the picture a bit. We still find that the combined wind and solar renewable fleet has a lower capacity value than many of the other resources on the system. And so the consequence of all this is we kind of shift a bit away from thinking about installed capacity versus load and more of a need to think about energy availability and just energy in general as a function of load. And that blends into the next concept a little bit as well in the resource adequacy domain. And so right now, much of the risk, like I said, is concentrated around our peak load conditions. And this chart looks at the expected unserved energy throughout the year. So on the y-axis, we have the months of the year. On the x-axis, we have the hours of the day. And so the upper charts are a system that's similar to what we have today, where much of that risk is concentrated in the middle of summer and in the early evening hours. As we have more renewable energy come onto the system, we find that risk of meeting our load spreads throughout different times of the day and different times of the year. So more risk in the winter time when we have simultaneously low wind and solar availability and high winter loads, as well as into the early morning and the late evening hours, as you can see here. Coupled with the slide two times ago, much of that risk is concentrated in the evening, as you see from the darker color on the slide here. But it's highlighting that there is a growing probability that we're going to have issues in other parts of the year. And so bringing all this together, it's really sending a message that we need to plan for and think about time periods away from the traditional spot where we've been looking around our peak load times, and thinking about the need to have available generation throughout the year, and not just need it, but specifically planned to have it available. So as we move from resource adequacy and blend in other concepts such as energy delivery, we move into the energy adequacy paradigm, and looking specifically at the variability of renewables and the need for enhanced flexibility on the system. And so on the left, you see kind of the average output of these types of technologies. Wind tends to be higher in the winter and in the nighttime hours. Solar tends to be higher towards the summer and the daytime hours. And so there's some natural blending of the two, but they're not perfectly correlated with each other. And so that continuously continuous transition, both in geography, that these resources are deployed in different places throughout the broader footprint, and in time, as one comes up and the other one goes down, leads to a need to move the resources on the system around more often and be more reliant on a smaller subset of the resources to manage that variability. And so we need to broaden out our definition a bit of flexibility. So rather than thinking about a subset of the traditional fleet following load, we now are introducing new areas of variability beyond load, such as your renewable availability, and actively managing it through curtailment, as an example, along with your conventional fleet, and hopefully bringing in load management as part of that picture to create more of a comprehensive view on meeting system flexibility needs. So all these things together lead to an increasingly connected system as part of that conclusion. And so one of the conclusions that we've continually laid out as an industry over the past decade is that being able to balance renewable resources across a wide geographic area is one of the most effective ways to integrate them into the grid. And we're seeing this kind of play out and magnify as the penetration of renewables increases even more. And both from a unidirectional standpoint, so areas of high renewable penetration like we see now, predominantly exporting to other areas, but more of a bidirectional or continuously a wide area balancing need. So on the left, you see kind of what the system as we have it today, around 10% renewable penetration in MISO. And we have some areas with higher wind penetration. We have very little solar penetration now, but we see both of these things continuously increasing into the future, and balancing needs become more important, both from a generation standpoint and then balancing renewables against each other. So when one area of the footprint is high and another one's low, we can serve the broader loading needs of the system with renewables in of themselves. And you also see the kind of the natural geographic resource preferences play out, where some areas have higher wind availability and others have higher solar availability. And all this together builds a picture for more connection between them, both from the operational side and on the transmission side. So as renewable penetration increases, the fuel mix itself drives different reliability risks. So if you think about the system today, you can pretty well predict what the dispatch is going to be for any specific load level on the system. When you have a peak load condition, you stack up your conventional resources based on your economics, and you can dispatch them as desired. So in this example here, in MISO, we have our nuclear on the bottom, and then we start stacking up coal and gas and other types of resources to meet our peak load conditions every summer. As renewables start to grow, they take a larger share of that. But as you can see in the three snapshots that we present here, MISO ranges from a low renewable penetration, lower on peak, to our peak renewable conditions. You can kind of see how that plays out and has a pretty predictable pattern to its dispatch. When we look at our 30% share of the annual energy in MISO and the Eastern Interconnection being met through renewable resources, that ability to predict what types of generation will be dispatched for a specific loading level becomes much more variable. So around peak loading conditions, you can have high wind and you can have lower wind. Same thing with solar, both conditions of high and low solar output, leading to some uncertainty in your dispatch. And as you start to move into your lower load condition periods, there's a lot less thermal or conventional generation online, and a significant amount of your resource dispatch is made up of renewable energy. We also start to see increasing times of curtailment on the system, both because there's just a high share of renewable resources being dispatched and its impact on the ability to deliver against the amount of load available, and just the kind of the inherent flexibility needed to transition from one state to another. When we look towards a share of 50% of the annual energy in the system being met by renewables, the picture starts to look quite a bit different. We now have times when the majority of the load is being met through renewable resources. We actually have conditions where 100% of the load could be met, but because of deliverability and cycling impacts on the traditional fleet, it's hard to get to that true point of delivering 100% renewable energy on the system. And so in the modeling work that we've done right now, it had capped out at 89%, even though there's more renewables available. You see that through the curtailment on the slide here. But what this means is that the majority of the devices on the system are no longer synchronous machines. They're now inverter-based or electronic type devices, and that leads to a very different reliability picture. And so there's a need to examine this in a lot more detail, and that's what we've done, and I'll talk about here. So the reliability risks are starting to shift. So it's not just that we have new reliability risks, but they're presenting themselves at different times of the year. We're seeing more stress during peak renewable conditions as well as low load conditions. And oftentimes these are synonymous with each other and are taking place within the spring and fall of the year. So the charts here represent a scatter shot or scatter plot where the x-axis is the load within MISO and the y-axis is the renewable generation output at any particular hour or loading level. And you can see that the picture is quite a bit different depending on the specific resource mix that we have in the system. So in the wind heavy, we tend to peak out less, so the actual renewable peak is lower, but we have a wider spread. So both in the low load conditions and high load conditions, we're likely to see times of high renewable penetration. When it's a little more balanced and we have a lot more solar in the system, we have a lot higher renewable peak, and you can see that at the upper right portion of the chart. And a lot of stress occurs more towards the peak load times when you also have peak renewable times. The charts at the bottom show the dispatch percentages that we have within the system at these different snapshots. And the work that we're doing here is really trying to identify how the reliability picture is shifting and where we need to focus our analysis on. And so it's looking at the full range or the full picture of renewables and load and loading conditions on the system to try to focus and understand how the reliability picture is changing and where we need to do more analysis on. So starting to look at the reliability picture and some of the transmission needs of the system. As I talked about earlier, one of our conclusions is that the complexity of integration was increasing sharply beyond 30% of the annual energy share being met through renewable energy. And this is starting to illustrate the need for longer and higher voltage transmission lines. You can see from the pictures here that at the lower levels of renewables, the issues that we're seeing as well as the transmission needs are relatively low. You can see at the bottom some of the indicative transmission solutions that we've deployed in order to get the models to solve. The work here that we're doing is meant to help us understand what the impacts will be and what the magnitude of change would look like rather than a detailed design of it. And so we're really trying to explore the range of impacts, and that helps us target the changes going forward. And so on the bottom, these are the indicative types of solutions that we're seeing were needed as more renewables come in the system. And so we have this crossover point as we go from where we're at today to 50% renewable penetration, where initially we have a lot more transmission needs at the lower voltage around the point of interconnection of renewables. And as that share continues to increase, there's more of a widespread reliability impact through primarily thermal issues that we're seeing in the system, along with some voltage issues, and the need to build out and connect wider areas in order to mitigate those issues. And you can see that with the kind of the need for the higher voltage, larger solutions. The actual map here represents a heat map version of what was built up here, and you can kind of see that there's a lot of the deployment across the broader footprint. A lot of it's concentrated, at least in the work that we initially did, around the wind-rich areas of the system. A lot of the earlier projections showed that wind was going to be a dominant player, and we're doing some work now to understand how high solar penetrations will play into this picture. But I think the general conclusion holds regardless. So as we dove into the reliability picture, we started seeing something a little bit different than what we normally see from our planning activities. Normally, much of the issues and the needs in the system are focused around steady state voltage and primarily thermal problems. But beyond 30%, one of the main drivers of reliability needs focused around voltage stability, and this can be characterized as weak grid problems. The plots here, the dark color, for simplicity, I've called them likelihood of grid stability issues. In actuality, it's the short circuit ratio across the footprint. And as we increased the amount of renewable penetration, we saw a significant amount of weak grid or voltage stability types of problems occur within the high renewable pockets that were starting to occur, and we're starting to concentrate as we needed more and more resources in order to serve the load and being deployed here. And initially, those could be solved with relatively conventional means through STATCOMs and synchronous condensers. But as the penetration increased beyond 30% into 40%, we started to see a need for call it non-traditional solutions. That the amount of traditional solutions was too much, and we were seeing too much interaction between those to effectively solve the cases. And so we deployed HVDC as the proxy for a solution here, something that we could get to work to connect the weak areas to the stronger areas of the system. But I think the general conclusion is that we need some type of transmission technology or generation advancement to support to provide dynamic support capabilities to the system. And there's a lot of work right now going on in improving wind and solar technology itself through the general term of grid forming inverter. And I think we need to figure out how to continually advance that work, but also to move it into system planning, and so we can start thinking about how that will play out as we rapidly increase the amount of renewables on the system. So you have some combination of new technological advancement as well as proactive deployment of existing solutions that will be needed to avoid some of these issues in the future. So I also wanted to spend a little bit of time focusing on frequency response. And so we spent a lot of time trying to understand what does the system look like with the loss of large amounts of generation in the broader Eastern interconnection. And so all the work that we've done at MISO here, was focusing on the intersection wide, and because we're MISO, a lot of the reporting out or the focus was on the MISO footprint itself. But we wanted to see both how MISO's performance as well as the EI's performance under large generation loss would look like from the frequency domain. And so the system we have now, we have a lot of synchronous machines that are always online, regardless of the loading level. As I described earlier, you can see that in the left dispatch charts towards the middle of the screen. On the right, we now start to see conditions where a significant amount of the penetration or of the dispatch generation dispatch is made up of inverter-based resources. And so when we looked at this in more detail, so for the loss of about 4,500 megawatts of generation was the largest trip that we modeled here. Around our base scenarios and up through 20 and even up to 30, there wasn't a lot of issues that we started to see. Around the 30% level, we started to see some issues start to present themselves, but things came back to normal, and we were able to solve the problem. When we get to the 40% and especially 50%, that's when the things started to get a little bit more risky here. And in the 50%, we started to see conditions where, like I said, the majority of the load in particular hours were being served by non-synchronous generation. They were causing issues on the system. And so when we tried to explore the range of solutions to address this, we came up with several different ways. First is we assumed that in our base runs that the renewable resources themselves wouldn't provide frequency response. We wanted to see just how far can you push the system without allowing those resources to provide it. As we all know, that's not the case in Raleigh right now. That wind and solar resources being built today will provide response if they're able to. And when we plug that into our model, in some of these conditions, there is enough natural curtailment on the system due to either overgeneration or bottling up of the resource, that the renewable resources themselves were able to arrest the fall in frequency and bring us back to a stable level. And so you have some natural trade-offs or co-benefits of curtailment due to other causes. But this isn't always the case. You can't always rely on curtailment to be available to meet our frequency response needs. And so we also looked at deploying battery technology along with frequency-enabled renewable plants to bring that frequency back to stable level. And it worked out quite well. And I think surprisingly to me, it took a relatively small amount of change to the system to maintain good frequency performance. And so the conclusion of this is from MISO perspective, that frequency response isn't likely to be a major problem. There's additional work that's needed to focus on potential islanding events or other things that would make the system look smaller than it is today. But from an interconnection-wide standpoint, we can get to pretty high amounts, and the solutions are relatively straightforward once we start seeing issues. So kind of in conclusion, a couple of slides to conclude our discussion today. So one of the things we're starting to see is that as we have more renewable energy coming onto the system, we're starting to see a need for different types of solutions in order to address some of the issues that we're starting to see there. And so new types of transmission technology is what's being highlighted in this slide. And so it's not just traditional AC lines and substations and transformers. It's other types of reactive devices and potentially batteries and HVDC facilities that are being married into this picture for not just energy delivery and balancing reasons, but also for grid stability purposes, as well as helping stabilize some of the oscillations in the system. So thinking holistically, around the deployment of more wind and solar renewable technology to the grid, as well as the backing down of the traditional resources. So what do we do in the system as the synchronous machines are either retired or just not dispatched during high times of renewable dispatch? And so understanding all those different conditions and deploying technologies because of them becomes increasingly important and leads to the need to integrate planning across several different types of domains than we're normally used to. So as a wrap up here, I wanted to provide some recommendations to the industry, to all of you listening on the call today on where we might want to go going forward. And so we've at MISO done a lot of work trying to understand the problem and getting in front of some of the additional issues we might start to see due to growing shares of renewable energy on the system. We think there's some straightforward ways of addressing some of these needs through either increased coordination of existing processes and technology or advancement and innovation in new areas. So planning for the grid of the future, we think needs to be more tightly coupled across different areas to account for shifting risks on the system. In many cases, we've separated out the way we plan for and operate the system into different silos. And as we have more renewables on the system, that paradigm is being increasingly challenged, and we need to couple these things either back together or find new ways to segment them. Second is to target improvements at kind of the change in risk periods throughout the year. And so it's hard to just look at a few time periods and plan for it and say we will have a reliable and efficient system in the future. It's becoming more important to look at a wider diversity of system conditions and risks and planning across that wide range as we think about the evolving system going forward. Third, resources from a broader region need to be continuously coordinated, and we need to have better visibility into all parts of the system, so both on the generation side and on the load side, and if we're going to blend things together more effectively, just enhancing visibility and control across a wide area becomes even more important than it is today. And so broad regional connections through transmission are needed not for just when things go wrong, when we have an outage of the transmission or generation facilities, but as a normal course of life to continuously balance the variability and energy delivery needs of the system as wind and solar is available at one time in one location and not available at others. That need to continuously blend things together becomes more necessary. Fifth, the new reliability metrics are needed to be incorporated into grid planning. So think additional energy concepts need to be thought about, whether it's variability or other types of flexibility things, specifically in the planning of the system. Needs to be considered. And then lastly, innovation is needed, as I highlighted, to address grid stability issues, but also across kind of the whole paradigm here is I think we can blend the curve down and get to a reliable and efficient future through innovation. And so as ESIG has advanced from the wind association to the variable utilities to ESIG, we need to think about the broader energy system and how we continually integrate that going into the future. So I'm at my time here. I'm going to open up for questions. Thank you for listening, and I'll turn over to Charlie.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. That was quite a walk through a broad range of integration and interconnection issues. Got a lot of questions here. I know we're not going to be able to get through them all, but as I said at the beginning, we will answer those questions over the next couple of days. Jordan will take a crack at them and we'll get something out to you at the end. So there's a range of questions, some rather high level, some rather nitty gritty. Let me start off with a few high level ones. A recurring question throughout was the question about storage and how it was treated, different aspects of it in the study. One of the questions, well, let's start with this one. The integration cost curve in the beginning, one of the early slides, as the cost of renewables went down, the integration cost curve went up. And there was a question or two about what was behind that rapid increase in the integration cost curve. How was storage considered, or was it considered in there, and what might be done with storage to try to bend that down? So
Yeah,
general question about storage. How did you think about storage or model it in the study?
yeah, they're great questions. So the focus of the work to date was looking specifically at the integration of wind and solar, and then figuring out what types of solutions could be used in order to help that integration. And so we explicitly excluded storage at the front end, but we've sprinkled examples in throughout of how storage can change the picture and help benefit things. And so we have additional work that will be coming out highlighting how storage will play into it. But for the conversation today, I'll highlight a couple. So from the resource adequacy work, we found that as you can deploy storage, you can change the availability of wind and solar and provide energy at times when they would naturally not be able to. And so you can help increase the availability there. But as the penetration increases, the amount of storage you need to do that also increases quite substantially. So it helps shift things somewhat, but it doesn't totally change the picture. Same thing on the flexibility side. Storage can be very helpful in providing additional flexibility to the system. But as we have higher and higher shares of renewables, the amount of storage that's needed to try to address specifically that goes up quite a bit. But there are a couple of examples of where storage played in very nicely, as we talked about with the frequency response work.
So 6 gigawatts of storage in the frequency response slide.
Yep.
And you're going to look at more storage for system balancing purposes or reliability purposes in the last year of this work, Jordan?
Exactly, yeah. So this is an ongoing effort at MISO. We haven't reached a conclusion of it. We've been having interactions with the broader community on what we've done so far and seeking feedback. And one of those areas of feedback was specifically on storage. And so we have a lot of work going on right now, which we'll be releasing and discussing over the next months.
Okay. A couple of questions about the consideration of the rest of the interconnection. You mentioned early on, one of the lessons learned over the years was that the very broad footprint over which the integration takes place can alleviate a lot of the problems. And questions about how was the rest of the interconnection modeled here as far as renewable penetration was concerned? Was just the MISO footprint experiencing the increased renewable penetration, or did you have similar sorts of things going on with your neighbors?
We had two philosophies going into it. One, we didn't want to target MISO at the expense or at the advantage of the broader interconnection. And then two, there's certain types of work, especially frequency response, that requires an entire interconnection look. And so we chose to model, when we talked about 30% or 10% or 50% renewable energy, this was an interconnection-wide number that we're doing. And when we modeled or deployed our renewable forecasts, we did it differently depending on which area of the interconnection you were in. So on one of my early slides, you could see a high amount of solar in the south and in the southeast portion, and higher amounts of wind in the north. And as you moved east, higher shares of solar at the expense of wind, which I think follows the resource projections in the industry, and oftentimes we use some of that within the work. So yeah, we wanted to see how the entire interconnection would work in this, and make our conclusions based on that.
Okay. Question about tools that you used. What's the range of tools? I mean, expansion planning, production costing, load flow, short circuit stability. Where was the emphasis and what kind of tools were you using?
Yeah, good question. We wanted to understand the integration across all these different focus areas. And so we focused on tools that could model those specific types of technical areas, but also ones that we could integrate together to pass what we learned from one area off to another. And so specifically the tools that we were looking at for the resource adequacy work focused on convolution and sequential Monte Carlo analysis. We did production cost analysis, your normal load flows or steady state, as well as voltage stability and small signal stability and frequency response or frequency stability. And so a whole host of tools across the whole spectrum with an eye on how the interaction in one area plays out in the other.
Okay. Question about the grid forming inverters, and you mentioned in the talk that in some ways HVDC served as a proxy for some of the more advanced technology. So question about what kind of HVDC technology, the line commutated or the voltage source converters, and for the grid forming inverters, did you do any modeling with those, or are those you just sort of acknowledge that that's something yet to be done?
So on HVDC first, we utilized VSC or voltage source converting HVDC technology, and that was kind of really needed to help solve some of those specific issues that we were seeing in the analysis. As far as grid forming inverters, one of the problems that we ran into as we were doing this work is finding models that we could utilize within the analysis. And so the analysis that we've done to date doesn't include modeling specifically of grid forming inverters, but we are working with a couple different organizations that are building out building out models that can be used in this work right now. So some of the follow-on work that we're currently working on is trying to bring some of that work within to MISO and understand how grid forming inverters would play into this picture.
Okay. A couple questions on the demand side. What sort of demand side modeling and assumptions did you make about participation, growth and participation of the load in the balancing?
Yeah, so this is very similar to the question that I answered on storage. So the focus here was specifically on how renewable wind and solar growth would impact the system, and then look at how other changes would play into that. And so on the demand side, it's very similar in the sense where if you can utilize demand side flexibility, that can be a contributor to the flexibility needs that we were highlighting. Same thing on the resource adequacy side. To the extent that you can deploy your demand side resources and target the new risks that we're starting to see on the system, that will also help alleviate some of the concerns that we're seeing. And so all the work we're doing is trying to highlight where some of the areas of concern are, and so we can help craft and deploy solutions to address them. And storage and demand side participation are two that we talked about quite a bit, along with, I guess, inverters to solve some of the stability issues that we're seeing, are some of the areas that I think have the most potential.
Okay, and one last question on transmission. We didn't see a lot of detail on transmission in the slides. We saw some big arrows on some big maps. Just curious about the insights that you're gaining from the need for future transmission in here.
So as a necessary part of the detailed analysis, we went through and did detailed transmission design, but the focus of the work wasn't on the solutions themselves. We made a lot of assumptions going into it on how renewables would be deployed and what type of renewable resources were going into it. And so we chose, because of that, not to focus too much on the specifics of what we did and try to focus more on the conclusions or the insights that we gained coming out of it. And so on the transmission, a couple things we learned that I highlighted is that in some cases, your normal transmission deployment was inadequate to solve some of your voltage stability concerns like you normally would. We saw a need for more regional and higher voltage transmission facilities as the renewable deployment increased. We saw a need for an expanded view on transmission technologies to solve the problems that were being highlighted here. So those are just a few of the conclusions that we had on the transmission side.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan. We're about at the top of the hour, so we're going to need to wrap it up. I mentioned earlier an email will go out once the presentation and audio file have been posted. And I want to encourage you to send any follow-up questions to info@isig.energy, and we'll get them answered and posted as quickly as possible. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you at our next monthly webinar on Wednesday, July 1 at 2 p.m. Eastern. The webinar will feature Caitlin Murphy, a senior energy analyst at NREL, presenting on the topic of end-use electrification as a source of system flexibility. This is a comprehensive study which explores scenarios and impacts of widespread electrification in the U.S., and it will provide some very interesting insights for all of us. I hope you'll be able to join us once again. Further information on all of the webinars and meetings can be found on our website at www.isig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails. Jordan, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you next month for the online version of the Forecasting and Markets Workshop, and with Caitlin and end-use electrification on July 1. In the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation.